bespoke radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network and KGRA, the Global Radio Alliance.
I need your help to get to the year 1985.
You're listening to Fade to Black with Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network.
Good evening. Fade to Black. Bespoke radio. For the masses. Yeah, man. All right, let's relax. It's a new week here on Fade to Black. Today's Monday, December 2nd, 2019. 336 days into the new year, just 29 days left. Can you believe it? We are live from a bunker somewhere in the middle of beautiful downtown Burbank, California, and I would like to welcome everybody listening all around the world, all across the United States, hither and thither, to and fro, back and forth, up and down, east and west, north and south, far and near. This is Fade to Black for KJCR, the Game Changer Network, and KGRA, the planet. I am your host, Jimmy Church. What is cracking, everybody? How you doing? How you doing? I hope you had a great Thanksgiving weekend. We did. Lots of fun. Lots of fun. And all of the traditions fell into place. Right? Great family, great fun, great food, ate too much, food coma, great leftovers. Man, what a weekend. And I was over at Coast to Coast, of course, on Saturday night. And here we are on Monday. And it just feels like I have not stopped. Thanksgiving seems like last week. Oh, wait, it was on Thursday. And that was just a bizarre, fun weekend. And here we are. You know, it's kicking off a great week. Tonight is Gregg Braden. And really looking forward to this, and wanted Gregg on. He's wanted to be on this show for so long. He's just so busy and schedules and everything else. But finally, tonight, Gregg is joining us. And this is our first time guest week on Fade to Black. And I can't believe it. Tonight is Gregg's first time on this show. And I don't know how that happened, but it does, and it did. So Gregg is kicking off our first time guest week here on Fade to Black. And what an amazing week. But tonight it's Gregg Braden. And Gregg is a 5-time New York Times bestselling author. He's a researcher and educator. Lecturer, internationally renowned as a pioneer bridging modern science, spirituality, and human potential. Gregg merges modern science and the wisdom of our past to reveal real-world solutions to the issues that challenge our lives. His research has led to 15 film credits and 12 award-winning books now published in over 40 languages. Gregg is a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Steering Committee for the Global Coherence Initiative, and the Evolutionary Leadership Organization. He has presented in over 30 countries. He has been invited to speak at the United Nations, Fortune 500 companies, and of course the United States military. The United Kingdom's Watkins Journal lists Gregg as one of the top 100 of the world's most spiritually influential living people. There's a tongue twister. For the 6th consecutive year. And he's also a 2020 nominee for the Templeton Award. I would like to welcome for the first time to Fade to Black, Gregg Braden. Gregg, I ran out of air. Good evening.
Hey, good evening, Jimmy. It's great to hear your voice. I am so thrilled to be with you and our live listening audience tonight. Thank you for that great introduction. Yeah, and the great music that led to the great introduction, by the way.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I really appreciate it. And you know what? Before we get things started, Gregg, this is our first time guest week, and I don't know why you are in that category, but it's taken us this long to finally get you on the show. But you're here tonight, and you're also going to get the first time guest disclaimer, which is this. Gregg, it's just you and I sitting on my couch having a conversation as friends. And where the conversation starts, it starts. Where it ends, but we're going to end as friends. There you go. You ready?
I'm totally ready. We've never done this before. I think we're just busy people. Jimmy, we've got very full lives, and I'm going to follow your lead. And wherever we go tonight, I'm happy to go there.
Yeah, and I actually want to start here. Years ago, I had the opportunity to introduce you at a conference up in San Francisco. And I went out, and I've been following you for years, but after introducing you, instead of staying backstage and just doing my thing, I actually went out and sat with the audience and joined you, right? And I went through, your enthusiasm is one thing, and the way that you interact with the audience is great. But what blew my mind was sitting and watching your presentation of the sites and the research and the locations that you've traveled around the world for forever. And I thought to myself, sitting there, Gregg is a doer. There's two kinds of people in this world, right? There's those that talk and those that actually go out and do these things, and they're fascinated with it. What came first for you? Was it the spiritual side of things, or was it chasing the science?
Well, first, thank you. I remember that introduction. I know precisely what conference that was for, and I did not know that you were in my audience. So thank you for being part of that audience. This is probably the hardest thing for a scientist to talk about is their own lives. It's easy to talk about the discoveries and the research. So because this is our first time and we're on your couch in your living room, I'll just share with you, I come from a very dysfunctional family, abusive, alcoholic family. I was born and raised in a rural area of northern Missouri in this Midwest of this big, beautiful country of ours. And at an early age, Jimmy, I was looking for refuge from my conditions, and I found refuge in two places. This is in the 1960s, so it was obviously in the music at the time and in the science of the time. The 60s was a really happening time, and in terms of science, we had manned space missions that were happening, and satellites, and science was really honored and really respected. In a way that you don't see so much today, at least in mainstream. So those two areas of interest quickly became my sources of refuge, and I left home at the age of 14. I was a musician. Started playing guitar at 8. Left home at 14. Moved in with a rock and roll band. Everybody was in their 20s and 30s, and I went to my first rock concert during that time, and it was Jefferson Airplane.
Yeah, man.
And for our listeners, anybody who's listening, I'll tell you exactly where it was. It was Memorial Hall in Kansas City, Kansas.
Wow.
And I saw this band move the souls of 30,000 people in that relatively small arena, and that was important to me. And not long after that, I had the opportunity to go to the Royals Stadium, Kansas City Royals Stadium at that time. It was Kansas City Athletics at that time. And I saw a man speak. He wasn't with a band. He just spoke. His name was Billy Graham. And it wasn't so much about his message for me, but what I saw was he moved the souls of 70,000 people. And the difference between that concert and what I saw at Billy Graham was this. At the end of the concert, people left and everybody was good, but they needed something more to give them the feeling that they had during the concert. They need to go out and buy the album, or at that time there was 8-track tapes, and they needed that. When I left that Billy Graham show, those people didn't need anything because the words that he had spoken changed something inside of them, and they began to look at themselves and their world differently. And I knew at that moment, I said I wasn't sure what I would do, but I think we get one shot at contributing to this world to make it a better place. And I knew that I would either do it through music or through science. And I knew that words would become a very powerful part of that. So that was a little background, and I became a scientist. I'm a degreed geologist with a strong background in geophysics, molecular biology, life sciences, computer science. And those sciences, Jimmy, have given me the opportunity to stay abreast with the new discoveries that are published in these really obscure journals that very few people get to see in pretty technical language. But to stay abreast with the discoveries that have the potential to change our lives, to make this world such a better place, and to help us to become the best version of ourselves, on the one hand, and on the other hand, early in my life, as you mentioned, I was drawn, there's a whole story about how it happened, but I was drawn to leave America and began a search that started in Egypt. 1986, it led me into Peru in 89 during a revolution. I was part of a revolution down there that eventually led me into Tibet and Nepal and India, and all through the American Desert Southwest and Australia. And what I began to understand, Jimmy, is that those who have come before us have been here a long time. We're 5,000 years of recorded human history. Mm-hmm. They didn't know science, but they understood us and our relationship to the world. And what I began to find is that ultimately what we call spirituality is just that. I'm going to make a distinction between religion and spirituality. Spirituality is the understanding of the human relationship that we have with ourselves, with our own bodies, with other people, with the earth, with our past, and with our future. The religions came along later and wrapped the rules and the dogma around those very, very basic understandings.
Right.
So I decided to cut through the religion, forget the religion, go right to the core. What did these people know that we've either forgotten, or what did they know that our own science is only beginning to understand? And what I found is that the language of science is the contemporary language for the mystical that was described in so many of these, and still is, in some of these ancient and indigenous traditions. And my feeling, my one shot in my lifetime to contribute and make this world a better place, and for me to become the best person I can be, is to cross those traditional boundaries that have separated science, the sciences, geology and chemistry and biology and physics. We put them in boxes, but nature doesn't know anything about those boxes. That's not the way the world works. And the sciences that have largely discounted the wisdom of our ancestors, to cross the traditional boundaries and marry these two great ways of knowing into a form of wisdom that gives us the evolutionary edge so that we succeed in this great transition that's sweeping the earth right now, where past cycles of civilization appear to have failed. So I know there's a lot in there. We can unpack that as we go through the evening, but for me, it was less of a quantum leap. It wasn't like a big aha. It was more of a logical progression as I began to follow the science, and I understood what the science was saying. At the same time, I was studying and experiencing these ancient indigenous traditions, and I said, they're saying the same thing in a very different language, and they're talking about things that we're only beginning to understand in the 20th century. How did they know this stuff? And what is it that we can learn from them today? So each book, I got to tell you, Jim, it's funny. I was doing a radio program not long ago. It's what I call one of the hostile interviews. We get those every once in a while.
Right.
And the interviewer came on, and he didn't read a bio. or any kind of a greeting or a welcome. It wasn't like, "Hi, Greg, welcome to the program." First thing he said to me when he came on, he said, "Braden, why can't you stick with one topic like everybody else?" He said, "Man, you are all over the map." He said, "You talking about genetics or the magnetic fields of the earth or cycles of time or ancient civilization?" He said, "For God's sake, just stick with one topic." And I was taken a little back. I wasn't prepared for that. And I thought about it, and I said, I do cover a lot of topics. I said, but if you look closely, every book I've ever written and each topic that you've just mentioned, they represent one facet of the human experience, of our experience in this lifetime. So in a very real sense, I have stayed with one topic. It just happens to be a big topic. And he said, "Okay, let's go to the station break," and I never heard from him again. So, so that was that. But so if you look at the breadth of the work that I've offered to date, and I'm not finished. There's a lot more coming. That's precisely what I've done. I've explored one facet of our experience in depth in each of those books, and those are the books that you mentioned at the beginning of the program that are out there now. So
I wanted to ask you about when you're going through the education side of things, and you're dealing with the possibility of professors and instructors that are closed-minded, especially to things that are outside of the box. They want to stick to the rules, which is fine. But was there a moment where you were, looking at both sides of the coin here, where you went, okay, hold on, wait a minute, this needs to stop. I don't really trust what I'm being taught here. There's something else going on.
Absolutely. And what you're describing not only has happened to me, it's happened to many of my friends and colleagues. Dr. Bruce Lipton, evolutionary biologist, was
right.
teaching medical students, and he was not allowed to share with his students the results of the experiments and the research that he was required to perform. Joe Dispenza, healthcare practitioner, chiropractor, began to understand that the human body, there's so much more to the human body than he'd been led to believe. And the three of us are friends and colleagues. We work together frequently now, but independently, before we knew one another, we all made the same choice to leave our respective professions. I could have stayed in the corporations as a scientist. I had a very good career. My last career was with Cisco Systems. I was their first tech ops manager in Palo Alto, California. Bruce was teaching at Stanford. Joe had his own practice. We could have stayed in those careers, written white papers about our discoveries that would be buried in academia. And we all made the choice, and others have as well. I'm just giving three examples. I'm not
Sure.
speaking for those men. I'm just sharing that we've had common experiences. Each of us, in our own way, made the choice to leave those respective professions, to take the discoveries, peer-reviewed science. These aren't our hypotheses necessarily or our theories. This is rock-solid science that simply is not being shared in the mainstream classrooms, textbooks. It's not being shared even in mainstream documentaries, and take this information directly to the people, because that's how you bring about change. And to be honest, the speed of the change that we're seeing in the world today, we really don't have the time to take a peer-reviewed paper and run it through 6 or 8 years of a peer-reviewed cycle and have it published in some obscure journal. So, we can still do that, and we write and we contribute where we can. But I did recognize pretty early on that what we're being taught in mainstream science is a subset of a much deeper, a much more all-embracing science that has the potential to free humankind from the bonds and the shackles of the suffering that have been the hallmark for 5,000 years of human history, including war. I believe that we have the ability to raise the standard of living for people in the world that, in a way that makes scarcity of resources obsolete because of the abundance of the resources available to us when it comes to these advanced technologies. We see evidence of it in ancient traditions, and the new science is leading us to these understandings in the world around us, Jimmy, but where I'm really focused right now is the world within us. because what I've also come to understand is the more we know, the better we understand ourselves, the less we fear one another and the less we fear change in the world. And the human body, our origin, our potential, the extraordinary capacities that we have are simply not shared in the mainstream. And these are the things that I'm really passionate about talking about right now. For reasons that I know that we'll get into, technology is actually infringing upon our very humanness right now. We're on the verge of giving our humanness away before we even know what it means to be fully human. So when we marry all of these things together, we're on this the horizon of this, just the threshold of the unleashing of powerful internal and external technology that changes everything when it comes to the way we think of ourselves and the way we solve our problems.
Do you find that the way that science, and I'm talking about physics and quantum physics and cosmology, biology, science is moving at such a rapid clip right now, and it is forcing them into areas of consciousness and spirituality that they're not going to be able to avoid, that they're going to continue to overlap, and we will have those answers about what makes us and the soul and consciousness.
It is. Two things are happening simultaneously. On the one hand, science largely has been hijacked in the modern world, in the Western world, by competing interests. So corporate interests have hijacked science to cherry-pick data and use that cherry-pick science to support corporate goals. The same thing has happened with politics. The same thing has happened with religion. Same thing has happened with academia. So science can only serve us, Jimmy, if we keep it honest. And science is designed to be constantly updated as new discoveries come to light. And what we find right now is we're living in a world where the academics want static science. There's a story. There's a battle. There's a battle unfolding in our world. It's happening. It's playing out before your eyes and my eyes and the eyes of the Western world. There's a battle playing out to maintain what's called the standard model. And that is the story of how the universe began and how humans began and what our potential is really all about. And there is an old way of thinking that's a very limiting way of thinking. And that limited thinking is a static model. The new discoveries that you're talking about are upsetting that model. So we've asked science to tell us who we are, and science is giving us answers, and many scientists don't like the answers. And so one of the places that I'm really seeing this is when it comes to evolution. And where the conversation gets really sticky, my friends who are college professors, well, they're my friends until we have this conversation, and then we don't talk for a while. Because the new discoveries are overturning 150 years of thinking when it comes to us, where we came from, how we originated, what our potential is. And I know we'll get into this as we go through our evening. But the new discoveries, this is the point, the new discoveries no longer support the old story. So I asked my colleagues, my professor friends, I said, why can't you share these new discoveries with your students? And they tell me three things. First, they say, Greg, if I share the new discoveries, they say it will invalidate my 40-year career of what I've been teaching my students. And I said, no. I said, science is designed to be updated. It would show your students how relevant science continues to be in their lives. And then he said, think how much money it would cost, to change all the textbooks. And I said, man, you're a dinosaur. Your students, they're learning online. I said, you change it on the server, and it's changed everywhere. And he said, well, I'd have to change all my class notes. He said, I've got 40 years of class notes, and I'd have to change all this. And I said, that's what they're paying you for, And so here's what I'm hearing. My professor friends are saying the new science is so revolutionary, I'm going to let the new professors, the new guard, I'm going to leave it to them to figure out how to teach this. I'm going to stick with the old story until I retire in a couple of years. I'm not even going to tackle this revolution that the new science is bringing on. We'll let the new young professors, take care of that. So this is what's happening. We're actually teaching our young people obsolete science based upon false assumptions, and we're asking them to solve the problems that we've left in the world based upon information that we know is not true. So that is where we are today, and it's changing, and the change is happening slowly. And as we travel the world, myself and some of my colleagues that I've spoken with, I'll just be very honest. When we leave the borders of this big, beautiful country that I love so much, we leave the safety and the borders of America, there's an openness beyond America that is so much greater to receive and accept and apply this information. America is open, but they're not nearly as open as we see people in Europe, South America, Australia, and Middle East. It's just amazing, this revolution in thought that is sweeping the earth so fast, Jimmy. And a lot of people just don't realize how fast it's actually happening.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on so many different points here, and we'll come back after the break. But I want to circle back to your comment about tech starting to replace our evolution, right? Our own growth. And I saw this is a couple of years ago, and it's like burned into my retina, Greg. I saw this picture. It's in a museum. It's in an art museum. And in the background, you see this ginormous, like 10-foot by 10-foot classic Renaissance painting. Beautiful, right? Just gorgeous. In front of it is a couch with 5 little girls sitting there staring at their cell phones. Right? It's like, what is going on? And I just looked, and it was astonishing to me.
It was very prophetic, but it goes beyond that. So we can begin this conversation now. We can pick it up on the other side of the
Sure.
There's technology. It's happening so quickly that technology is being introduced to replace human biology, and I'm talking about even replace neurons so quickly. And I'll give an example of this here in just a moment. But the key is when we replace our biology with wires and circuits, that biology begins to atrophy within our bodies. And when it happens in one generation, it can be fun to accept these new technologies. But pretty soon, just like there was a generation where cell phones was an option, now, we hardly know anyone that doesn't have a cell phone. It's a way of life. And there's an entire generation of young people that only know communication through digital communication, through their handheld device. A couple of years ago, Elon Musk, I think all of our listeners know who he is here, developer of PayPal and Tesla and SpaceX, and a brilliant man, visionary, innovator, wealthy, has got a big vision, and he's pushing the boundaries of technology. And I'm not saying it's right, wrong, good, or bad, but I'm saying that it is opening our eyes to the morality of the role that we want technology to play in our lives. So here's a perfect example. He just took a company public called Neuralink. This happened last year, but it actually made the news mid-year this year. And it's the first interface actually implanted. It's a chip implanted into the human brain. So neurons are actually linked into ports on this chip in the human brain to link the human brain directly to the hard drive of a computer with wireless technology. So, young people, when they hear that, they say, oh, sweet, man, I can play my games,
right,
without using any wires. Here's the deal. We are such technologically, biologically sophisticated beings. We have neurons that already perform that function that we are not even told about and we don't even use. And what the science is showing is, from other technologies, is when humans begin to rely on something other than their own biology to perform even reproduction. This is actually something that's happened in some parts of Asia, where the human reproduction is being replaced by other forms of reproduction. And what they're finding is the fertility rates have dropped, the sperm counts have dropped, the number of mortalities now exceeds the number of live births. And they're attributing this to to the role that technology is playing in our lives. We begin to replace human neurons with chips. One generation, it's kind of a cool thing to do, but pretty soon that's all we know. And we begin to lose that aspect of our humanness. And again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong or good or bad, but at least know who we are, know what that potential is before we make the choice to give it away.
Yeah, it only takes one generation. That's it.
It does.
It's altered immediately. Let's take our break right here, Greg. Our guest tonight is Gregg Braden. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Network and KGRA The Planet. You can follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio, and you can follow Greg on Twitter at Gregg Braden, Greg with 2 G's, and the links are right up in Twitter in our feed. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, Gregg Braden is with us. I want to remind everybody of the scheduling changes this week. Tomorrow night is Fader Night, open lines. Wednesday night, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince are here. And then Thursday night, live from India, Deep Prasad. Tonight, it's Gregg Braden. And Greg, we were discussing right before the break about replacing our own biology with technology. There are aspects to it that I'm sort of okay with, like, say, for instance, music. I don't think guitar is ever going to go away, but we've got a lot of electronic drums out there, right? There's that part. Or digital painting and the creation of digital art. I don't think paintbrushes are going to get replaced. And when you look at real fine art, you can appreciate and feel the human element in it when brushes are used. But then there's the other part where if we start to depend on technology to think for us with smart devices, smart everything, smart cars, things are going to change. Our brains will not be responding the same way as they did a couple of generations ago, right?
No, absolutely, Jimmy. And I was just going to clarify that when we came on this side of the hour. You know, the technology is never good or bad. It's how it's applied.
Right.
And what typically happens in science is that the technology is developed first, and then we have to catch up. We have to backtrack and say, you know, how do we use this, and do we have the right to use this? I've been in the scientific community for most of my adult life, and one of the things, the ongoing battle that you will always hear between scientists at the water cooler or over the coffee machine or, you know, in the bar after work or in the laboratory, it's the same one. There's one school of thinking, one camp, that says because we have developed this technology, because we've done it, it gives us the right to apply this in our lives. If we were never meant to have it, we never would have developed it. That's one way of thinking. Another way of thinking is just because we can does not necessarily mean that we should apply this in our lives. It's like, you know, you might have a Ferrari. I was just with a friend in Zurich, Switzerland, who's got a Maserati. And the speedometer clocks it much higher than, you know, they really want you to drive on the freeway. So just because you can doesn't necessarily mean that you should. So I'm going to give you a perfect example of this. Up until a few years ago, the idea of gene editing was pretty much science fiction, you know, on any kind of a large scale. A few years ago, technology was developed, and I'm sure you've got a very sophisticated audience here, and I'm sure they're familiar with this, called CRISPR. Mm-hmm. So just the way that we edit words with a word editor on the computer, you can bring up a strand of DNA and delete and add and splice genes with an editor the same way. So we've had this for a while, and, you know, scientists have been using it with worms and flies and, you know, certain kinds of crops and things like that. Last year, 2018, all of a sudden, completely unexpected, a Chinese scientist announced that the first set of twins had been born as the result of gene editing. And the scientific community came down on him like a ton of bricks, and they said, wait a minute, you know, we never agreed that we were going to use this, you know, for real. we're talking about developing it and what the potential is, and he was of the thinking, hey, if we weren't meant to use it, we wouldn't have it. So now the science has to catch up, and there's a huge scientific debate over how we edit the DNA of unborn children. Who is it that makes the choice of what's a desirable trait and what's not? And how do they filter that through their history of, their experience? And do we make all children have the same intelligence, IQ, or, intelligence quotient, or do they all have the same color of hair, or what's an undesirable color of hair that we want to take out? And science is really struggling with this right now, and this is an example of where the technology has advanced before the morality.
Do we have to? Right? Do we have to have a DNA police? Right? Like DNA courts?
Well, This is where the next part of our conversation comes in. My personal feeling, and I'll be very clear with you sitting here on your couch and anybody that might be listening. I'll separate the peer-reviewed science from my personal feeling. The research that I've done, the science that I've seen in this, over 60 years of my life now, there are some things I really think that we shouldn't be messing with because of the way they were created, and human DNA is part of that. One of the paradigm-shattering discoveries. I mean, this is just blowing the doors. It's like an earthquake shaking the foundations of the life sciences and biology, is that evolution, as we have been led to understand it, is not our story. Now, I want to be really clear about what I'm saying here. I'm a geologist, and I've seen evidence of evolution in the fossil. Evolution's a fact. I've seen it in the fossil record for many plants, many insects, many forms of life. The story of evolution breaks down when it comes to humans. And this is really, really causing a lot of problems. The theory of evolution is in trouble right now. So I'm going to give you two different ways of looking at it. One is the physical evidence supporting evolution has never existed. If you look at one of those evolutionary family trees you see on, the PBS or the Nova special or in the Smithsonian magazine, you see us, a skull of a modern human at the top, and then you see all the branches of this tree connecting it to all these other forms of life. And if you look closely, those branches typically are either broken lines or the legend tells you that they are what are called inferred or speculative relationships. They are believed to exist, although no physical evidence has ever been found linking us to those other forms of life. Physical evidence. Now, that theory was proposed in 1859, and from the time it was proposed, a lot of scientists had a problem with the theory. So we've known this, and if that is all there was, I probably wouldn't even be having this conversation with you. But the new discoveries now that are changing everything go beyond the physical evidence, Jimmy. Now we're looking at DNA. So I think some of our listeners probably remember there was a movie, Jurassic Park, the first Jurassic Park. Came out a few years ago, where it was science fiction at the time, where DNA was extracted from the fossilized remains of ancient forms of life. And in the movie, that DNA was reconstituted. It was brought back to life. Well, to the best of my knowledge, we haven't gone quite that far. But what we are able to do now is I say we, the scientific community, we have the ability to extract the DNA from fossilized remains of ancient forms of life, including the forms of life that were once believed to be our ancestors, that we had descended from. So now it comes from the bone marrow, and a lot of times the ribs of those primitive beings are where you find the best preserved bone marrow. So now we're able to build a genome of those ancient forms of life and compare it to modern DNA today. And this is the kicker. This is what's blowing the doors off of the ideas of evolution, is that there's not enough DNA overlap to suggest that we have descended from those forms of life. For example, we did not descend from Neanderthal. We now know that. There's not enough common DNA to show that we descended from them. We shared the earth with them, and we probably interbred with them, and that's why some people do. If you go to 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and you have your DNA analyzed, you might find that you have some Neanderthal DNA because there was interbreeding. But if we shared the earth with them, we did not descend from them. So this is one of the discoveries. We did not descend from those forms of life. But here's where it gets really interesting. We showed up, we as anatomically modern humans, this is what we're called, AMH is the acronym in the scientific jargon, anatomically modern humans. We appeared on Earth about 200,000 years ago, and scientists agree with that. There's no controversy there. The problem is how we got to be where we are. There is no evolutionary path leading to our emergence. We showed up, Jimmy, fully with a brain 50% larger than our nearest primate relatives, with this advanced neural network in our heart and in our brain and in our bodies, with the same body proportions we have today, with the same capacities, the same capabilities we have today. And what the DNA is showing is we showed up and we have not changed since we appeared. That is a problem for Darwin's idea of evolution. When we start looking at the specific chromosomes that give us our uniqueness as humans, this is where it just goes right off the charts, because we're looking at mutations in the human genome that could not have happened through evolutionary processes. And the scientists say that in the Proceedings for National Academy of Sciences, for example, on the volume Genetics, talking about human chromosome number 2. Chromosome 2 gives us our larger brain. It gives us our capacities for empathy, sympathy, emotion, self-regulation, compassion, all those things that make us human. That chromosome is a result of a fusion, Jimmy. It's a fusion of two pre-existing chromosomes that, after the fusion happened, the DNA was tweaked. Genes were removed, genes were added, and all of this didn't make any sense to us until we saw the CRISPR technology within the last few years. It looks like a CRISPR-type event, except it happened over 200,000 years ago. And others, chromosome 7. Hey, you're going to love this. You're a musician. I didn't know this. I'm a musician. So as a musician, have you ever wondered why chimpanzees that share 98% of our DNA can't sing? You ever wonder? Well, you're never going to see a chimpanzee sing Stairway to Heaven, right? And the answer why that cannot happen is because there was a mutation in human chromosome 7 that had not occurred previously for 75 million years. And all of a sudden, this mutation happened, and it happened exactly at the same time, that 200,000-year mark. And you see this time and time again. So we can go on and on with this, Jimmy.
Well, let me jump in though, Greg.
Yeah.
What are we suggesting here? I'll give you a suggestion.
Sure.
Okay, this is my suggestion that quite possibly we were placed here. That we just appeared here. How that happened, I don't know. I don't know if it's off-world, if it's somebody visited here and did some CRISPR work 200,000 years ago, but I can tell you what it wasn't. It wasn't a lightning strike that magically altered our DNA.
It cooked the soup in the ocean, right? It wasn't the lightning.
Right, exactly.
Well, see, Jimmy, what you're saying, this is the very point. The evidence does not support the story, and the point is we don't have the answer because we're forcing our young people to follow a story that the evidence doesn't support, even though we know it's no longer true. There's a huge difference between forcing all of the existing data into a predetermined story,
sure, to
support that story, and following the evidence to whatever story it's going to lead us to. And my feeling is as we follow the evidence to wherever it leads, we're writing a new human story. It's going to free us in so many ways from the shackles of these limiting beliefs that we've had in the past. But the point is, we can't get there scientifically until we free our scientists from the bonds of these pre-existing ideas that are being imposed upon them through the system, through the university system and in the academics. And I'm not saying throw Darwin's ideas out. We've got smart young people in these schools. Give them all of the data. Give them all of the evidence. Show them Darwin's ideas. Show them the new discoveries so that they've got everything they need to go after this answer and tell us in a way that is accepted, in a language that's not based in religion, in the language of science, who we are and where we've come from. And when we begin to understand those things, then we begin to look at one another very differently, and we begin to look at our relationship to the world very differently. And I think that's where peace begins, and that's where a compassionate, sharing world really begins. So the new discoveries, I mean, what I'm saying to you, this is peer-reviewed science. I write about my books. I'll talk about it at the Conscious Life Expo. I'll show great pictures of how these things happened. The mutations happened all at the same period of time, that 200,000-year mark. So as a scientist, what I have to say is that when I'm asked what caused those mutations, I have to say it appears there is some form of intervention. Now, what that intervention is, I don't know as a scientist, but here's what I also know, as I have spent so much of my adult life with indigenous traditions and ancient texts. I've not studied every tradition, Jimmy, but every one that I have studied, as different as they are from one another, there's a common theme. And that common theme is that we are the product of an intelligent intervention, and that we are related to something so much more than the limited way that we've been led to think of ourselves in the world. We're part of a much greater community, and we have this extraordinary potential. And it's for that reason, I'm going to tie this back, it's for that reason, until we embrace the deep truth of what that science is showing us, I don't think we want to be tweaking the DNA that we appeared with 200,000 years ago, or another way of saying it is the DNA that we were given, this extraordinary potential. In evolutionary biology, a lot of people don't know this. Charles Darwin is noted often as the author, but he had a co-author of the theory. His name was Alfred Wallace. And one of the tenets of evolutionary biology is that nature never over-endows a species with more than it needs in the moment of its existence.
That's right.
So in other words, it's only when circumstances present us with a need to develop new abilities and new capabilities, new ways of seeing or hearing or tasting or assimilating food or whatever it is, that we develop those. And this is the problem. We appeared over-endowed. We are an over-endowed species. I know some people love to hear that, and you can take that in a lot of places, but we are an over-endowed species because we appeared 200,000 years ago with an internal technology light years beyond what we needed for our everyday existence, already intact. It did not develop slowly, gradually over a long period of time. That is a problem for evolutionary biology.
Now, can I play devil's advocate for a second?
Sure, sure.
I
love that.
I'm your guy. I'm one of your fellow educators sitting across the table as you say this, and I lean forward and I say, "What do you mean intelligent intervention? What are you really trying to say here?" I want you to be clear. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That was what I would say to that educator. I would say, you just hit the nail on the head. I don't know, and neither do you, educator, and we don't know as a society because we've not allowed ourselves to answer this question to the fullest extent. We're running the other way, discounting the evidence. When I say intelligent intervention, our own scientists, peer-reviewed science, there is an organization, the Proceedings National Academy of Sciences. This is a peer-reviewed publication. When they began writing about human chromosome 2, they were the first that said this fusion and the tweaking that happened after the fusion occurred that gives us our uniqueness could not be the product of evolutionary processes. Something happened that evolution cannot explain. So this is where there's two ways of thinking of this. I have colleagues that say we've got to answer the question. We have to know who we are before we know what our potential is. And I'm taking the other path, Jimmy. What I'm saying is, let's develop the fullest extent of our extraordinary potential, these extraordinary capabilities that we all have of super cognition, super perception, super immune response, super longevity, the ability to access deep states of intuition on demand, to heal our bodies quickly than science has been led to believe. And we do all this. I've read about my books, do it in our workshops, do it to my colleagues, by embracing the deep truth of who we are. I think that will lead us to understand our relationship to who or whatever it is that is responsible for us being here. It's a very, very different way of thinking.
Yeah, and I want to continue this after the break, but I want to ask you this before the break. Did the technology movement that happened at an extraordinarily fast rate back in 1995 until today, it is completely out of our control now. It's too much, too fast, and it is causing changes on this planet with consciousness, with the infighting, the divisiveness, the complexity of things. Was it too much, too fast for us to handle?
In my opinion, I don't think so. And the reason I say that relates to something that we have not yet talked about tonight. But as a scientist, I'm a systems thinker, and I'm also process-oriented. And when I look at systems, I look at the history of our planet in terms of systems and cycles. And I look at the history of life and human civilization and human emergence in terms of cycles. And when you step back and you look at the big picture, Jimmy, what you find, it's a very different story than what we've been led to believe. When I was in school back in the 50s, 60s, early 70s, I was taught that civilization began in a primitive state, and it was a linear growth up to this pinnacle that we find today. The problem is the archaeology doesn't support that linear model. What the archaeology says is that we are the product of cycles of civilization. And those cycles are largely driven by cosmic cycles that affect everything from climate to sea levels to consciousness. So when I look at what has happened within the context of those cycles, what I say is we are right on. It's an evolutionary acceleration, and the technology had to happen quickly to push us to understand our relationship to that technology within where we are in the cycle. So I know that's a lot to unpack, and when we come back from our break, we can talk about that in more detail.
How do we slow it down, though? That's the thing, so we can fully understand how it's affecting us. Is there a way to pump the brakes and take a breath?
In terms of the technology?
Yes.
I don't think so. It's kind of like the genie's out of the bottle.
Right.
What has happened is the traditional boundaries between the sciences are collapsing. So the discoveries in physics are now being applied to biology, and the discoveries in chemistry are now being applied to physiology and neurology, and there are new sciences like neurocardiology that are linking the heart and the brain in ways that we never did in the past. So I think the breakdown of the boundaries between the technologies is leading us to a wisdom that is greater than in its totality than what we have done with the compartmentalized wisdom of the past. I'm just going to give a quick example. That's the best way to describe this. When I was a geologist back in the 70s, I was studying geophysics and the magnetic fields of the Earth. It was obvious that the magnetic fields of the Earth are changing very quickly. And my question was, what does that mean to us, to biological beings? And my colleagues, they looked at me and they said, don't ask me. I'm a geologist. Go ask a biologist. So I'd ask my biology friends, and they'd say, hey, don't ask me. I deal with cells. I don't know anything about magnetic fields. And that's a perfect example of where the compartmentalized science was not serving us. And now we know that every cell in our body is influenced by the shift of the magnetic fields of the planet. High magnetic fields, we are more cooperative, less aggressive, and more peaceful, more willing to solve our problems working together. Low magnetic fields, we become much more aggressive. And that's important when you look at the cycles of where Earth is and how the magnetic fields are part of those cycles.
Do you think that we've got 1 minute? Is this something that, suggesting the Egyptians, is this something that the ancients were cognizant of, that they fully understood this relationship between us and the planet?
What I found is that those who've come before us, the ancient Mayans, Toltec, Olmec, the Egyptians, I've spent a lot of time with the Tibetans, modern-day Tibetans, studying ancient texts. Jimmy, they did not separate science from spirituality from art. And think about that. If you don't separate those, when you see something that's beautiful, that moves you inside, you have a feeling, you're changing the chemistry in your body based on that feeling. And that becomes a science. And when you begin to merge science and spirituality and art, you begin to think of your world and yourself and your relationship to other people very differently. And I think with the breakdown in the traditional boundaries of the sciences, we're moving in that direction.
Let's take our break right here. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Gregg Braden. Fascinating conversation. We're going to pick up where we're leaving off right now. It's Fade to Black on the Game Changer Network and KGRA, The Planet. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Gregg Braden. And you can follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. The conversation's going down. Hashtag F2B in the sandbox. We're going to go through a few thousand tweets tonight during the show. Get Gregg involved at Gregg Braden right there on Twitter. Gregg, going back to, let's circle back for a second. Oh, by the way, I was just listening to the commercial for the Conscious Life Expo. And that Ancient Secrets panel, I might have an empty seat if you're going to be there Friday night.
I have to talk to my office. I will make a promise I can't keep, but I heard that as well, and I thought it was very intriguing. So I appreciate it. So to be continued off air.
Yeah, exactly. Going back to this CRISPR situation and the fusing of chromosome 2 has always intrigued me, and 7 as well. If we go back 200,000 years, what did we, if it wasn't nature that did this, some type of high technology was involved, whether it was a past civilization here on the planet, which I could totally embrace, or a drive-by of some kind of civilization that came by and saw us and did a snip. But if it wasn't done by nature, we are opening up the door to some pretty fantastical theories here, of which I'm open to any of them. Sure. But for us to just appear here 200,000 years ago, that doesn't make sense. And there's got to be something logical.
Well, it depends on who you talk to, because everybody has a story. When you look at the ancient traditions, the ancient Sumerians, they had a story. The 1990s, I had the opportunity to tour with Zecharia Sitchin when he was still in this world, and his work, his interpretation, the translations and interpretations of Sumerian texts told a story that he interpreted as genetic manipulation, and that was, his perspective. When you go to the ancient Egyptians, they have their story that we're not from here, that we're deeply related to the star system Sirius. And there's a whole story around that. You go to the Aboriginals and you look at their 60,000 plus year continuous lineage of history and story and their DNA lineage. And their creation story says that we are the product we are related to other worlds, and that we are the product of those otherworldly relationships. Hindu traditions say the same thing, and ultimately, what I find interesting, Jimmy, even the Christian traditions I think most of our listeners know that the modern Bible is the product of a series of edits that happened around the 4th century. And we know that those edits occurred because in the mid-20th century we found the oldest records of the unedited text. We found the Dead Sea Scrolls were the oldest records of the Old Testament and the Torah, and the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt was the oldest records of the New Testament. And we found biblical books that had never been seen because they were edited in that 4th century panel. The Council of Nicaea, during the time of the Emperor Constantine. I talk about that in some of my books. When you look at those, and when you look at the indigenous traditions, all of them say that we are the product of an intervention. And what's interesting is they all say that they are responsible for us being here. They. It's always multiple beings, whether it's Elohim in the Christian traditions, which is a plural, or in the Mayan traditions, whether it's the multiple beings that went through multiple iterations and tried different materials to create us. That the first humans were not able to sustain the power of the soul in the physical body. They had to find the right formula, and they tried different materials. I mean, these are common themes that you see run through these ancient traditions. Is it science? Absolutely not. But when you find a common theme that runs across so many traditions covering such vast periods of time, it's kind of like the flood story. You know, every ancient tradition shared the flood story from their unique perspective. So they all vary from community to community, but the bottom line was they all experienced a flood, and as a geologist, I can tell you the flood actually happened. We have the geologic evidence of that flood. So the idea of an intervention, I'm the first to say, Jim, I mean, I've got my personal feelings about what has happened, but as a scientist, I have to say I don't know. And that's, to me, that's the whole point. We won't know until we unleash the intellect and the technology and the passion of these young people that are dedicating their lives now to science to answer the questions, until we free them to follow the evidence to where it leads, rather than forcing them to preserve this story that protects corporations, protects religion, protects academics, but it's not our story. So I think we've reached a point in our evolution. We're globalizing a planet, 8 billion people learning how to live together, and we're forcing together men and women, and we think differently, and we're forcing together religions that think differently, and we're crossing traditional borders of oceans and mountains in ways that we never did before. We're a globalized society, and we're asking ourselves to accommodate this globalization through a thinking based in separation, through Darwin's ideas of competition and conflict and scarcity. And as we allow the science to reveal these truths, and as we embrace what the science is telling us, the science is telling us nature is based upon cooperation, not competition. That's important. That was a message I shared at the United Nations with Bruce Lipton when we spoke there. The science is telling us we're not the product of an accident, a fluke, some random mutations in biology. And that's important because the value of life, Jimmy, has been cheapened by the thinking that we are the product of some accident. And that's all it is. And when we begin to understand that there's some intelligent intervention that appears to underlie our existence, we begin to think of ourselves differently. And it doesn't have to be about religion. It's just about the respect for the potential that we come to this earth with. So can I just share a quick story?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So over the break, you gave me a few minutes to reflect on the conversation we had before the break. You asked me if I thought the technology happened too quickly, beginning in '95 and moving forward. And it's a good question. It's a big question. And I hesitated because I knew we were running up to a break, and that's why I didn't share this story. A few years ago, I was hiking in a remote area, in the Four Corners area. It's an archaeological site. It's known as Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. And I met a native man that was hiking there at the same time. And for a lot of reasons, rather than passing by one another, we struck up a conversation. And he began to tell me a story, and I think his story has direct relevance on what we're talking about here. He said, Gregg, a long time ago, he said, the people of the earth lived very differently than they do today. They were close to the earth, and they remembered who they were. He said, but then something happened, and nobody knows exactly what that something was. He said, but the people of the earth began to forget who they are, their relationship to the earth and to the cosmos and to themselves. And they so longed for that connection, even though they didn't know what it was. They felt empty inside. He said they so longed for that connection that they began to build outside of their bodies the machines that actually mimic the potential, the capabilities that they have inside of their bodies. And he said, we live in that world today. He said, we live in a world where we're building the machines and the devices that reflect what we already do in the cells of our body. And he said, we'll continue to clutter our world with more and more technology, and our lives will become more and more cluttered until we realize that what we are building is us. And then we'll let that technology go in the outer world because we will become more sophisticated technologically inside.
Is he referencing a form of entropy? That we've got to.
I think it could be. I
Right.
worked during the 80s, during the Cold War years. I worked in the defense industry and the aerospace industry as a software developer. Projects. One of them was called SDI, Star Wars Defense Initiative, and I've seen tremendously sophisticated technology. Is the reason I'm sharing this. And as sophisticated as it is, Jimmy, I've never seen anything built outside of us that we don't already do from within. Every cell in our body is essentially an electrical circuit. We've got capacitors, we've got resistors. We receive photons of light. We emit photons of light. We store information. We retrieve information. We release information. And the internet that we're building reflects the way that we share information on a quantum level. And the computers that we've built and the way we store information in computers is reflecting the way information is stored in ourselves. So when I recognize that, and I think back to what my native friend said to me, and then your question, you asked, Gregg, do you think it happened too fast? There's a school of thought, Jimmy, that our creations, the things that we create, our music, our film, our video, our books, our sculpture, our art, are more than diversions. That the things that we create around us are consciousness informing us of what we need to know about ourselves in a certain period of time. And from that perspective, when we look at this explosion of technology, I can't help but think maybe this is us asking ourselves to remember who we are and this extraordinary potential that we have so that we don't destroy ourselves in the absence of the knowledge, that we embrace this technology and learn what it means. And again, I said this earlier, the better we know ourselves, the less we fear. And when we're not afraid of the unknown, that's when we can freely love. We can love the planet. We can love one another. We have the passion to make the world a better place rather than fighting for survival and trying to have enough because we believe we live in this world of scarcity. So I think all this, it's a big conversation, and I think it all plays out together. But it's interesting if we think about our creations as something more than just diversions. If we say, okay, every movie that's made and the music that's out there, and I'm still a musician and I'm fascinated by what's happening with music today, and the art and the music and the books, if all of those things are us asking ourselves to remember something about ourselves, what would those somethings be? And although all the creations are different, if you look at the themes, the movies seem to come out in themes. Remember The Matrix, the very first Matrix came out. It was hugely and unexpectedly successful. And it was telling us that there's a world that we can't see, but it influences the world that we can see, and that we're a part of that world. And then movies like Inception, and how our dreams are part of that, and Avatar, our relationship to nature. They were hugely successful movies. And they're all telling us that there's something more to our existence that is available to us if we're open and willing to accept what those some things are.
And
so I think there's a beautiful symmetry in everything that's playing out here.
Right, and I couldn't agree with you more. There's a reason why all of that resonated with everybody worldwide as quickly as it did, because we're all seeking these answers. And I wanted to jump back to the DNA question and the DNA police. If the altering of chromosomes and merging, I should say, of 2 and the altering of 7. If that happened, that's one thing, and we are who we are today. But going back and using CRISPR technology, not to increase our IQ or choose eye color, right, and design our children, but to go back and remove diseases and cancers and muscular dystrophy or whatever, and remove those from our DNA sequences, is that okay?
This is where we began the last hour. Again, I think the technology is never right, wrong, good, or bad. I just spoke with a student in Dubai this morning, and we had this conversation. The splitting the atom. I live in northern New Mexico, just down the road from Los Alamos, where the Manhattan Project occurred. And I'm fascinated by this, because the technology was developed. It could have gone so many different ways, Jimmy, but it was developed during a time of war. So, of course, it was applied for a wartime application. I think there are a lot of good things that can come from CRISPR technology, and even the chips that we were talking about earlier, Elon Musk chips. If you are a young man or a young woman on the battlefield in Afghanistan, and you are in a vehicle that's been hit by an IED, and you are now disabled, and all of a sudden you have the ability to use your arms and legs again because of this technology. What greater gift could there be?
Right.
And I have no problem with that at all. To use it recreationally, where kids just say, "Man, I want that chip implanted in my brain, so I can play video games without having to, wire up to my computer." It sounds like fun at first, but what our young people are not being taught is that there's something so unique, so rare, and so precious about the soft technology, the technologically advanced, highly sophisticated biology that is their bodies. They're not taught that. And when we begin to replace that with machines, with chips, and we do it on a large-scale basis, on a generational basis, pretty soon, if you look at what the science fiction is telling us. We always see these films of future races that have lost or given up some aspect of their humanness that they long for again, coming back in time, in some of the movies, or coming from another planet. They're much more advanced than we are, but they lost the ability for emotion, for example, or they lost the ability to conceive a new life inside of a body. It's all done outside the body. So I'm saying I think we need to know what it is that we're giving away before we give away our humanness. We need to embrace what it fully means to be human. And then we have a choice. We know what we're giving away if we choose to give it away, rather than just allowing these things to become a part of our lives without really even knowing what they mean.
Why do we have that type of amnesia? Why is it that we absolutely are so quick to forget what we have learned from the past? And we can do it in a matter of weeks, it seems.
I think a lot of it goes back to what we call our story. There is a battle for our story. There's a battle for our thoughts. It's playing out in the media. I think we all know that. But it goes deeper than that. There's a battle for our very humanness. And most people don't have the time to even embrace the fact that this battle is playing out. They don't have the time to research it, and it's not being carried in the mainstream.
Right.
Well, you're really seeing this. I gave an example earlier in Japan, for example. Japan has always kind of pushed the edge with technology and sexuality and things like that. young couples are opting for AI babies, artificially intelligent robotic babies, in place of the real babies. And they're opting for digital relationships rather than, body-to-body human relationships. As a practical matter, it's just easier for them to do that. They have a strong work ethic. They're very busy. They don't have time for these things. But the correlations, along with them embracing these technologies, they're one of the countries where the birth rate, the sterility rate of men is increasing. The infertility of women is increasing. The birth rate is declining. And the mortality rate is greater than the birth rate. So they're losing population. And now all of a sudden they're playing catch up. They're saying, "Wow, how did this happen? And why didn't we see this?" But I think it's, there's a human tenet that says use it or lose it. And if we're not using this biological technology, it begins to atrophy. And once it's gone, it's gone. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying we need to be aware of what we're giving away before we give it away.
Yeah, they didn't understand.
Lose it forever.
You're absolutely right. Japan didn't understand. I get the way that they embrace technology. I totally understand that. But they are now looking at the real numbers, that a generation from now, they're not going to have workers, right?
It's true. I will talk about this at the Conscious Life Expo, and I've got the graphs are very, very graphic. I mean, you can't argue with the graphs. When you see the steep drop in birth rate and how it compares to mortality rate and how that compares with the rise of the technology and the way the technology is being used, I think it's like the canary in the coal mine. These are all examples. The technology, it's not good or bad. It's how it's applied. And we are now, how can we make those decisions until we know who we are? And that's the whole point. And the whole point, science is trying to tell us. They're giving us the answers. We said, science, tell us who we are. Where do we come from? How did we get here? What is our potential? Do we have the potential? Can everybody be a Jason Bourne, for example, with instant total recall and supercognition? And the answer is pretty much yes. There are techniques we teach in our programs. I'll actually do some at the Expo. And the intelligence services use the same techniques. It's about accessing this biology, the neurons in the heart, in the brain, and harmonizing them through what's called coherence, and being able to apply that coherence in our lives in very unique ways, as well as the longevity enzymes that give us the ability to not just heal our bodies, but to actually reverse the biological markers of aging. Now, chronologically, we'll always be a year older than we were a year ago. But biologically, it is not only possible, it's people do it all the time.
Well, you're an example of that. I mean, look how you look right now. See, most people don't know. Gregg is actually 178 years old.
Well, you can't see me right now. So the first thing I looked at for this interview, I said, is this a video interview or a phone interview?
Hey, I wanted to ask you.
But let me tell you, I apply in my life what I have learned, and I spent a lot of time with monks and the nuns in the monasteries of Tibet in the 90s, the early 2000s. And Jimmy, routinely, we met people there 115, 120, 25 years old. I saw their papers. It's not out of the ordinary, and you would never know. They looked about half their age. Their skin color was good. Their eyes are sharp. Their memory is sharp.
Right.
I've been with indigenous traditions in South America. They don't have Alzheimer's because they're older. They don't have breast cancer. They don't have prostate cancer. It's not about the aging. Our bodies are designed to heal and regenerate long beyond the 70 to 100 years that we typically accept today. But it's not about the aging. It's about how we live as we attain those ages.
Now we're gonna head towards. Well, let me jump in because we're gonna head towards a break right here, and we'll pick up where we're leaving off. But I have this question for you. I need your quick response: Strat, Les Paul, or Martin?
Black Strat, Jimi Hendrix signature model with a reverse headstock.
Okay, I'm going to hold this up to the camera right here. There's the question, and I circled Strat. Gregg and I, before we jump into, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Stratocasters hanging next to me on the wall here. And
when we finish this program, I'm going to hit a Strat in my home studio tonight. That's my next gig before I go to bed tonight. So you and I love the way you think.
That's what I'm talking about, Gregg Braden. We are taking our break right here. This is Fade to Black. Somebody just posted up, Jimmy's going to get guitar in somehow on this show. He's a professional. Gregg, we'll be right back. This is Fade to Black on the Game Changer Network and KGRA, The Planet. Stay with us. Welcome back. Fade to Black. Gregg Braden, our guest tonight, an amazing conversation. Very happy with this conversation tonight. We got some guitars in. And Gregg, check out your Twitter feed. I posted a picture for you.
All right, I'll do that when we get off here. I just want to ask, does this night seem like it's going as fast for you as it is for me?
Blazed by, and I can't believe it. I can't believe it. And going back to where we left off, which is this. With technology, which I embrace, right? I've got GPS in all of my cars, and I've got the cell phone. I sit in a beautiful studio full of technology, and I get that. I understand it. You and I are talking right now because of technology, but with things like GPS or phone books and a contact list, are we losing the ability to remember things? You know, like phone numbers or directions. Does it force our brains into becoming complacent and lazy?
I think it's how we use them, Jimmy. You know, I just ran into this afternoon. Somebody, my office manager, was asking me some questions that revolved around numbers, and it's easy to pull out a calculator and punch some buttons. I personally make it a discipline to pull out a piece of paper and do the math. So that's just a personal thing for me. But what I know, understanding what I know about neurons and the way neurons work in the heart as well as the brain, and I know your listeners have heard this axiom before, is neurons that fire together wire together. So when we begin to not use those connections, they do begin to atrophy. The chemicals that hold those connections in place begin to atrophy because we no longer use them. So I embrace technology as well. I think it makes no sense for us to fight the technology. We are like children in a civilization where the technology, we've opened the doors, we've unlocked the secrets to some of the greatest mysteries of creation and nature. And we've done it, Jimmy, without answering the most significant question about ourselves. So, I mean, think about what we've done. You know, we've split the atom. We understand how to edit and DNA. We put people on the moon. We're now bouncing signals off the edge of the universe. On the one hand, and the other hand, Jimmy, we scientifically, maybe not spiritually, but scientifically, we have yet to answer the most fundamental question of our existence: who are we? And until we answer that question, who are we? What do we use as the yardstick by which we measure our technology and we measure our worth in terms of how the technology is applied? One of the, this is one of the few programs that I can have this conversation with you and with our listeners, our hundreds of thousands of listeners who are now in your living room all around your couch.
Right.
If you, I have a lot of friends in the UFO movement, phenomenon movement, who've become very specialized in the abductee phenomena, and I know you have a lot of guests that talk about that as well. And one of these professionals, these are professional therapists, professional psychologists, psychiatrists, as well as biologists, who are helping people to come to terms with the experience that they've had and what it means to them. And to help them do that, they interview these people, and they have found common themes across the interviews. And they've shared some of those themes with me. I don't talk about it a lot typically from a public stage because it typically doesn't tie in to, whatever I've been invited to speak about. But it is a phenomenon. One of the common themes, Jimmy, that comes up in the abduction phenomenon is that the beings who have abducted these people, when they embark upon a conversation, whether it's telepathic, a lot of times it is telepathic, or whether it's a verbal conversation, what they convey to the abductees is just what we're talking about tonight, that they are the product of an technologically advanced civilization who made a choice at some point in their past to adopt technology before they understood what it was that they were giving away, and that they lost so much of their uniqueness to the machines, they long to have that back. And they're interested in the abductees for that reason. They're interested in the DNA, they're interested in the neurons, and in the way for these particular people, for whatever reason, the way that they have these people use their biology in their lives. Maybe they are, compassionate healthcare workers, or maybe they are hospice, workers, or whatever it is. So I think that it's interesting that although each case is unique, among the common themes is the theme of an technologically advanced society that has moved forward with their technology in a way that has led them from the depths of their uniqueness, and they want that back. So I think there's something that we can learn from that.
Is there another aspect to all of this when we're looking at the changes here? Do we have to, as a planet, as a civilization, do we have to go to the edge? Do we have to go and stare into the darkness and get the crap scared out of us to realize that we're heading in the wrong direction and that there is another way about this? Is that what we have to do?
This is a really. I have this conversation frequently with my biology friends and with my philosophy friends, and there's a very interesting thing about us humans in that we seem to experience what we don't want before we know we don't want it.
Right.
And that's very different from setting a course to a vision of what we do want and working toward that vision. So we had to have not one but two great holocausts on the planet, and we say we're not going to do that. We had to have a couple of world wars, and we say we don't want that anymore. Well, we could have said, let's just live on a planet of peace, but we didn't do that. So my experience, and this goes back to a conversation that we just barely scratched the surface of 2 breaks ago. It was in the second segment. What the archaeology clearly shows, one of the benefits that's coming from global warming is it is melting ice in places that have seen only ice in recent memory. And when that ice melts, it begins to expose archaeological sites, and the Earth-penetrating radar is exposing archaeological sites, and we're beginning to have a very different picture of human civilization. So when I was in school, again, back in the 50s, 60s, or early 70s, I was taught, and many of your listeners were taught the same thing, and their children today and grandchildren are still being taught that civilization began about 5,000 years ago, right around the time of ancient Sumeria, and then Egypt came along, and then things like Rome and Greece and the Incan civilization and Mayans, those all came along later, and we were taught that's the history of the world. So that civilization began about 5,000, maybe 5,500 years before present, BT, before present. Now, what the archaeology is showing is there are archaeological sites. I take groups into a place in northern Peru that is called Caral, C-A-R-A-L. Corral collapsed when we're told that civilization began. It collapsed about 5,500 years ago. It was the most technologically advanced civilization and is the oldest technologically advanced civilization in all of the Americas. It's older than the Inca, than the Olmec, than the Toltec, than the Maya, than the Aztec. The history books are having to be rewritten now to accommodate this discovery of Corral. And then you go back from there. You know, you talk about Göbekli Tepe and one of the great mysteries. And we've got the new information as a geologist looking at the Giza Plateau. You know, we know this is what's called fluvial erosion on the Sphinx and on the pyramids, fast-moving water over long periods of time. That hasn't happened since the ice melted during the Ice Age, and that was right around 10,000 years ago. And we're looking at places like the Gulf of Kambat in India, a city 3 miles long, 5 miles wide, under 125 feet of water. We either have to say that the city was built underwater, which doesn't make a lot of sense, probably is not likely, or that it was submerged after it was built, and that didn't happen until after when the ice melted and the sea levels rose. And we're looking at cities that are being discovered that were thought to be fairy tales. Gulf of Kambat is one. It's in the Mahabharata, and the evidence of atomic war in in places that we're finding glazed sand across the desert and radioactive skeletons and huge craters that can only be seen from the sky, and they correlate with what the Hindu traditions tell us was a great battle that happened that has always been believed to be make-believe, a fairy tale. So when you put all these together, now we're looking at technologically advanced societies twice as old as what we were taught. They're going back over 10,000 years, and Göbekli Tepe now is over 13,000 years. And now that we're looking beyond Earth, we're looking at the archaeology on the lunar surface and beyond, those sites are now being dated around 50,000 years before present. So rather than this linear model, it appears that civilization is cyclic, that we reach a certain level of complexity that is unsustainable, and that civilization collapses, possibly due to war, and begins again. And we have to ask ourselves, are we following that pattern? Are we living that cycle right now? And if we are, do we have the wisdom to choose wisely so that we don't fall into the same path as those civilizations that have failed in the past? And I personally believe that we, this generation, we're answering that question right now. Well, I may not know that we're answering it, but we're answering it, and technology is a big part of it.
And, and this is what I find interesting, because anthropologists and archaeologists, even geologists, had all said the same thing when John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, did the documentary, and they said, look, just give us some evidence of something before 3000 BC, and we have a conversation here. But until then, we're right and you're wrong. Since then, you have Corral, you have the caves outside of Tel Aviv, you have Göbekli Tepe, and other sites around the planet that clearly suggest the opposite of what we've been taught, but they still choose to ignore it. When is that stranglehold going to end?
Well, we mentioned in the last hour, there's a battle unfolding in our lives to maintain what's called the standard model.
Right.
And that standard model begins with the beginning, with the origins of the cosmos, the Big Bang Theory, when and how that happened. It begins with human origins. Who are we? Where did we come from? Are we the product of random mutations, an accident, and a fluke of biology, or is there some sort of intervention and some level of intentionality underlying our existence? And civilization, does it go back further than we've been led to believe? One of the really interesting things that has happened, and I was, during the Cold War years, I did work in the aerospace industry, and then because it was wartime, I was drafted into the defense industry. That's where they needed the expertise. And it was a really bizarre time. It was such a weird time. Jimmy, when the two former superpowers were poised, to do the unthinkable. And I remember it was emotionally going into the secret vaults where we worked every day and creating the software and working with Star Wars and things like that. My prayer was that somehow we were all working so that the horror of wars that we had seen in the past would never happen again, and that the technology would give us a way to work together so that we would never see those wars again. Well, it was during that time that the former Soviet Union and, the former America, because it was a different country then, they had the agreements that they would never share what was found when those countries went onto the lunar surface. They were the only two countries that had the money and the technology to go to the lunar surface. And they've honored that agreement. And we now have, those two countries are too broke. America is not going anytime soon. Russia's not going anytime soon. But there are countries that are not part of that agreement. China, for example. And China has said that when they land on the lunar surface, they are going to beam back to the Earth live, whatever it is they find there. They were not part of that original agreement. My sense, and I know you've had guests on that have talked about this, and George has, and for years. Mm-hmm. My sense is when we see those archaeological remnants, we're looking for microbes as signs of life on the lunar surface, right next to archaeological remnants that are now estimated to be 50,000 years old. And when we find those remnants, people are going to automatically think, it must be ETs, UFOs, which are very possible. I think it's very possible they could be. However, based on what I now understand about cycles of human consciousness and civilization and history, I think we're going to find that those are not remnants from an alien civilization. I think they're us from another time in our history when we achieved great and beautiful things because we worked together before we went to war. And if we did that in the past, just as our world is coming so close, there's a push for war. You can feel it. Mm-hmm. There is an element that wants war, and there's a lot of our global community that doesn't want the war. It's happening right now. Can you imagine what would happen if we beam back from the lunar surface evidence of something that we created at some time in our past, and we said, if we were able to do this together 10,000 years ago, what could we accomplish if we worked together now? And it has the potential, I believe, to be the most unifying experience for the people on the earth, just at the time, Jimmy, when our world is becoming so polarized, something that could bring us together in such a powerful way.
Yeah, something to give us hope. Something to give us hope.
I think there's evidence that we will see that in our lifetime.
Right. I couldn't agree with you more. And one of the plays on this is that, are we alone in the universe, right? And answering that question. Well, okay, that's fundamental, and we've been, contemplating that, for millennia. But if we find out that there is a reason to clean up this planet, to live, to exist, because we have a reason to make friends out there in the universe, it would be the opposite of if they wanted to project on us, Greg, that we are alone in the universe, then you know what that does to this planet? It's like, let's burn this sucker down. Right? Yeah. There's no reason.
Every human for themselves.
Right.
Every country for itself. That's survival of the strongest.
That's right. And
this is precisely the point. The best science of the 21st century is now overturned that fundamental tenet, and peer-reviewed journals are now telling us nature's fundamental rule is not competition. It's not survival of the strongest. And by the way, those were Darwin's actual words. I researched them in his manuscript. He called it survival of the strongest. Later, it was interpreted as survival of the fittest. His words were survival of the strongest. And what we now know is that nature's fundamental rule is cooperation. And the more conflict and the more competition that you see, I mean, I'm not denying it's there. Obviously, it's there. But the more of that conflict we see, that tells us how far we've strayed from this fundamental truth of the way nature operates. And that was part of the message. Bruce Lipton and I were invited to speak at the United Nations a couple of years ago as a team. Me as an earth scientist and he as a life scientist. And this was part of the message that we shared, is that nature is based on this fundamental rule of cooperation. Do we think that we're so different from the natural rules and the natural laws and rhythms of this planet that we don't need to follow that? And if we're serious about solving the problems, and that is supposedly what the United Nations is all about, then it behooves us to follow this fundamental rule of cooperation rather than conflict and competition. So this is where it all comes back to where we began this conversation, Jimmy. The better we know ourselves, the better equipped we are to deal with whatever life brings to our doorstep, and the less we fear the unknown. We are what are called self-referencing beings, so we tend to hinge our sense of well-being on what's happened in the world out there. So, you come home from work and, you see a bunch of impeachment hearings and the government looks like it's dysfunctional and the markets are crazy and, wars breaking out all over, and you try to have dinner with your family and, it can be a pretty rocky road. And you come home and, all of the things are just the opposite, and it influences the way that we feel about ourselves because we hinge our sense of well-being on the external world. As we embrace these new discoveries, what we find out is it doesn't change what happens in the world necessarily, but it changes the way we feel about what happens in the world. And when we begin to write the new human story, that is where we open the doors to new ways of thinking and new ways of working together, and cooperation is a big part of that. So I think it is worth our time and worth the energy that it takes to answer this fundamental question, who are we? Because it's going to change the kind of energy that drives this planet, that brings electricity to our homes. It's going to change the way we grow our food. It's going to change the way we heal our bodies. And ultimately, it's going to change the way we treat this planet that we live on.
And before we wrap up, I want your thought on this really quick. And you're more than welcome to hang on for some overtime if you want to continue the conversation. But it's this: why is it that it's so hard to do the right thing? Right? It's easier to be bad, right? And we know this.
I think the answer to the question is it's the environment that we find ourselves in. We have been everything that's happening in the world is only happening because of the way we've been taught to think. So all the atrocities, of the wars and what was happening with ISIS and, the conflicts that we see and the revolutions and all the bad and all the good things, they're the product of a way of thinking. We are conditioned to think about ourselves as random mutations, the value of life. Our young people, it's easy for them to take their own lives. It's easy for them to take the lives of someone else. It's easy for them to disrespect their bodies. I asked a group of young people at one of my programs recently how they felt, how optimistic they were about their future. And every one of them told me that I won't use their exact language, but what I'll say is they said the world is so messed up, we are only thinking about today, and we're not thinking about what's going to happen 10 years from now or 20 years. We don't think we have a future. We don't think that world is even going to exist. It's the way we've been taught to think. So as we begin to change the way we think, all the things you're saying, I believe, change. This is where science comes in. Science is a language that's trusted and it's respected, and it's more of a neutral language than the language of spirituality or religion or politics. So I think the ideas are accepted more readily when they are conveyed through the language of science. And science is revealing some very, very powerful, very deep truths about our extraordinary potential and what extraordinary beings we really are and what an extraordinary planet we live on and our relationship to that planet. That brings us back to where we started 2 hours ago.
Yeah, I know, and I'm not ready to end this conversation. I kind of can I talk you into another 20 minutes?
I could do 20 minutes. I've got another. Seriously, I have another interview coming at the top of the next hour. So,
okay, it's up to you. I've got notes here, and I just don't want. Okay, let's take a break right here. I'll take the break early, and I'm gonna hold you captive.
So I'm going to text my next interview and tell him I'm going to 10 minutes to the top of the hour. Okay.
Yeah, and tell him who it is.
Oh, I'll tell him. All right, I'll see you back here after the break.
Yeah, let's take a quick break right here. Our guest tonight, Gregg Braden. We're going straight into some overtime. Thank you, Gregg, for doing that. I'll take the break early. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Network and KGRA, The Planet. You can follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. You can follow Gregg Braden at Gregg Braden on Twitter. We've got everything up in our feed. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. Heading into some overtime with Gregg Braden. Saw this coming. Too many things left on the table, Gregg, and I want to thank you. And I'm watching Twitter, and everybody's very thankful that you're able to hang on. And one of the things that I don't want to, we were talking about right before the break, which is the manipulation of the media with our consciousness is something that it's a mental thing, but I think it's also physical, because I found that you brought up ISIS, right? I watched one too many ISIS beheading videos on the news where I started to physically change, get sick. I stopped watching the news, and I did this 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm a better person today because of it. I read the news. I choose what I'm going to be fed. I don't allow to myself to be manipulated by video. Is this something real in that we are physically being changed, and does the man understand this?
Well, that's two questions. It's possible to be changed, and again, this goes back to a very powerful statement we began with. There's a battle that's playing out for our thoughts. It's a battle for our story. It's a battle for our humanness. Those are three very distinct aspects of this battle. And to the degree that we allow media to play the role in our lives that it has in the past, it has the potential to change us. We begin to think. There was a linguist in the early 20th century that worked with the Hopi traditions, and he was the one that made the discovery that the words that we use not only determine what we think, but they determine how we are even capable of conceiving our world, the words, the language that we use. And that was what opened the door to the understanding that media actually can change the chemistry in our brain.
Right.
It happens in a couple of different ways. When, I was a kid growing up in the Midwest conservative community, northern Missouri, 50s and 60s, and men were taught to discount your feelings, discount your emotions. It's, it's just a feeling. What we now know is the recovered texts, excuse me, from the Nag Hammadi Library, for example, tell us that the power of human emotion in the heart is actually the power to change our physiology, to change our bodies. When we have a feeling about what we see, we emit very specific kinds of chemicals. This is why art is so powerful. When you see art that makes you feel good, your body begins to emit the chemicals that reflect that, the dopamine and serotonin, but it also emits what are called neuropeptides. Every emotion creates a neuropeptide in our bodies. And those neuropeptides play a very powerful role in our physiology. So when young people are watching video games all day long, it begins to change the way that their brain functions. And the same with the media. I think part of it is a conscious manipulation. But here's the good news. So few people, we live in a country of about 330 million plus, give or take, in the United States today. So few people are watching what we call news. You go through the airports, and CNN is blaring on every flat screen in every restaurant, and at the gates at the airports, and you would think that everybody in the world is watching what you're watching, and the reality is the ratings, the numbers are so low for the network news that relatively few people are actually being influenced by what you're talking about. Those that watch may be influenced. And when I go to live events all over the world, I ask a question. I said, who stopped watching television? And at least in our audiences, the majority of people recognize that news is no longer news. It's commentary. It's somebody's idea, somebody's spin on an event that has happened. And I prefer to interpret those events through my own lens of perception. And I have to work really, really hard. I'll tell you, it's very difficult to find a solid source of objective news. And I don't think there is one. But I find news feeds from other countries. When I'm out of this country, I'll give you a perfect example. I was in Australia over 9/11. I could not even get back into my own country. It was a very strange time. And I watched 9/11 unfold through the eyes of Middle Eastern and Asian and Australian television. Sky News was out of the UK. Some of us are out of India. And I saw CNN World. The pictures were the same. The commentary was so very, very different. And I was amazed at how different the commentary could be. So I think, to answer your question, it is possible to be changed. It is possible to be manipulated if we allow ourselves to be. And I think so few people are really plugged into that media any longer that I think those that are probably in the minority. So that's my feeling on that.
Yeah, I found that when I would go to a conference or head out, that I would consciously I would make the decision to disconnect. In other words, no internet, no cell phones, no social media, no television on in the hotel room, nothing. And I would come back and I would relax. I'd come back from those escapes and get connected again and find myself physically change. And I thought, okay, you know what? There is actually something going on here. And that's what I had to do.
Well, sure. So here's what's happening, and it started right after 9/11. And I think you probably are very aware of that, being in the industry that you're in. It was almost the next day. All of a sudden, the way that we receive our news changed. The music that was playing in the background, the visuals,
right?
The way information was being presented to us, it changed almost overnight. So what has happened is that if we allow ourselves to be plugged into those news cycles, we're constantly fed crises that have no resolution. So what happens is we hear things that we cannot possibly solve or do anything about that threaten us, our families, our well-being, our future, our economic well-being, our physical well-being. That's stress. So our bodies can respond with a stress response. It's called fight or flight. And so those are high levels of cortisol, adrenaline, shifting of the brain chemistry to accommodate stress, which is okay for short periods of time. But when there's no resolution, and it goes on day after day, hour after hour, and then you go to work and your coworkers reinforce it because of what they've seen, that changes our chemistry, it changes our physiology, it changes our biology. And there are some people that it can be very addictive, Jimmy. Some of those chemicals are very addictive. And I know people that are really caught up in that. But you have to ask yourself, when you finish watching one of those programs, what you've just said, Jimmy, how do I feel when I finish? Do I feel closer to my family, or do I feel closer to my neighbors? Do I feel closer to my community? Am I angry? When you go to bed at night, how do those things make you feel? And an honest answer to those questions, I think, tells us everything that we need to know about our relationship to those news cycles.
How do you avoid negativity? How do you keep yourself grounded?
You mean negativity from other people?
Yes,
or...
yes.
I'm really blessed in that this is the 36th year I've done this work in one form or another. And I have not been in every nation, but I've been on every continent. And I have to tell you, it's because of that I'm optimistic. The people of this world, Jimmy, the people of the world, I think, are pretty much good people. I mean, there's always exceptions. But the people aren't having the problems. People know how to share resources. They know how to share food and water and energy. And while they may not always like one another, I think people typically love one another. And I've seen people, total strangers risk their lives for other strangers without even giving it a second thought. It's like we're wired to do that. So it's not the people that are having the problems, generally. It's a handful of individuals in positions of power that are bumping chests. It's not the everyday person on the street. And the everyday person on the street is now awakening to the fact that something has shifted on the planet. Something's changing in the world. And that something can no longer be ignored. And you're seeing that reflected in the systems that are collapsing. The only systems that are breaking down are the ones that are unsustainable. Unsustainable economies, unsustainable ways of producing energy, unsustainable ways of containing and confining people. Those are the only systems that are breaking down. There's a lot of other systems that are just fine because they are based upon sustainable ways of thinking and living. What we learn, and this is the value, we're covering so much ground and so many topics, but they're all pieces of the same story. Jimmy, what we learn from these cycles of the past, and we look at how climate has driven civilization cycles, and we look at how war has been a consequence of changing climate and competition for resources, and we're doing the same thing right now. But what we find when we look at those cycles is that the key to successfully navigating the kinds of changes that we're seeing is, on the outside, is what we call localized living. So where we're not dependent on a central anything, no central forms of energy, no central forms of economy or commerce, localized agriculture. And we're doing this. Farm to table is a perfect example.
Right.
Localized banking where the money stays in your community. And now that we know that we're in a cycle where the climate is changing, I'm a geologist. I mean, I can see this stuff in the ice core records, and that's the whole point. Climate change is a fact. It's not happening for the reasons that we're being led to believe. It's been politicized. But it is happening, and we have to make a choice. Are we going to adapt to the changes that history, that the Earth shows us happen on a cyclic basis? They've been happening since before humans appeared. You could see that in the ice core records. We showed up 200,000 years ago. We're looking at climate cycles much more extreme than what we have right now that go back twice that, over 400,000 years before present. So, why not adapt to these cycles, decentralize, so that when a big storm that we know is going to happen hits the Northeast, for example, that localized sources of food are able to get into the grocery stores. They're not depending on trucks moving across icy highways. And why not harden the power grid? Put those power lines underground. So, the ice storms are going to happen every year. But doesn't mean you have to lose power to your hospitals and to your homes and to heat in your home. And think of all the people that would be employed by hardening that power grid. And think of all the trees that you don't have to cut down to make telephone poles that are destroyed every year. I mean, just common sense. These are just very simple things that that make sense when we understand where we are in the cycles. If we don't understand those cycles, and my mom was a perfect example of this. When she and I, we can't have these conversations any longer. She doesn't even know who I am right now. But before that happened to her, we were able to have these conversations, and she felt like the world was just falling apart at the seams. And it's easy to think that if you don't step back and look at the big picture and see where we are in the cycles. The cycles are intense and they're brief. And it's where we are in the cycle that I think determines how the options we have and how we respond. So I'm just giving a couple of examples, when it comes to climate, but it goes for economy and it goes for conflict. All of these are following rhythms and cycles in nature.
Yeah.
One of the real interesting things that I've seen as a scientist is this is the way that nature functions. Nature creates systems that become more and more and more complex until they are unsustainable in their complexity. And then they collapse, but they don't go all the way back to zero. They collapse to give way to a higher order. So I'm seeing the collapse of unsustainably complex systems to give way to a higher order in our personal lives, in our communities, in our nations, with economies, with energy. But it's all happening in this really compressed period of time, Jimmy. And if no one tells us that, it looks really scary. But if you know what's happening, you could see light at the other end of the tunnel. And then you say, well, let's make the best choices possible. What's the best decision based on what we know? And this is where all the science that we're talking about tonight and much more, this is where the science comes in, and the wisdom of our past, because we're not the first that have been through these cycles. What can we learn from those who have come before us?
I firmly believe, and I say this all the time, that I walk around with flowers hanging out of my pockets. And I say that not to be naive, but I know that we eventually are going to mature. We're going to grow up, and we're going to figure all of this out. I don't see the dark side in our future. I just don't, and I totally agree with you. There's a way out, and there is a path forward, and I'm excited for our children and our grandchildren. And that's the position that I will always have. I want to ask you really quick before I do let you go. You do a lot of stuff around the world. You lead a lot of tours, and you're always out there speaking. Where's the best resource for everybody to stay informed?
The best place, the one-stop shop where you can see everything is my website. It's Gregg Braden, www.greggbraden.com, and that's Gregg with 2 G's. Because 2 G's is just a Greg, and 1 G is short for Gregory, and my mom didn't want me to be a Gregory, so I'm just a plain old Greg, greggbraden.com, and it's got all of our live speaking events and tours and books and things like that. It's all right there.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you once again here in Los Angeles. And believe it or not, it's just in 10 weeks.
It's right around the corner, and first of all, I just want to thank you, Jimmy, for the opportunity to be on your program. I don't know why we haven't done this before. I'm glad we did tonight, and it's because of programs like yours and resources like this that people are discovering that there is another way to think about what's happening, and that the science and history is really on our side. And if we could step back and look at that big picture, we get a very, very different view. So I look forward to seeing you at Conscious Life Expo, and if not before, and I look forward to our next time. Absolutely, Greg. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evening, my friend. Great conversation tonight. Thank you so much, Jim. Take good care. You too. Gregg Braden. And again, follow Greg on Twitter. He keeps everything up there. And so that's at Gregg Braden on Twitter. And the links for greggbraden.com are over at jimmychurchradio.com. You can just click and head straight over. I am going to take a quick break right here, and I'll come back and wrap up the evening. This is Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at jchurchradio. Email is jimmy@jimmychurchradio.com.
on the Game Changer Network and KGRA, The Planet. I'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. Had to take a quick break. What a great conversation tonight with Gregg Braden. Phone lines are lighting up. I don't have time to take any calls. Or should I? Should I take a call? Should I grab a call? That wasn't my plan. I wanted to ramble. All right, I'm just going to grab this call. Hi, you're live on Fade to Black. Who's calling?
Hey, Jimmy, this is Pat.
Hey, Pat, how are you, man?
Pretty good. It was a good Monday, man. I got the goodie box today. I'm so appreciative.
You got a good goodie box, too.
Oh, dude, you're telling me.
And as you look at the good stuff there, what stands out?
Actually, the first thing I did was open up that bottle of CBD and did some of that. I've been out for a while, so it was like, yes. And then I went straight for the damn coffee.
Yeah, right on. Well, that's a life-changing thing right there. Let me ask you this, Pat, before I let you go. I've only got 2 minutes. Extraordinary conversation tonight with Gregg Braden, and for you, what's your takeaway? What did you get out of the show tonight?
Man, there was so much stuff. My head's just kind of floating out there right now, so I can't pick one thing, dude. It was just so much stuff.
Yeah, my take is this, science is where we do need to constantly focus. We need to constantly look at the science, and not so much the science about what we are taught. It's the science that is coming out today and what we are learning. It is happening so fast, and I talked about this in my lead-in into the show tonight, but it's exactly what Gregg kept coming back to tonight. We can't ignore the science. The science is speaking to us. Science has always been about correcting, and presenting, and that's what science is about. Today, science is trying to not correct things. And he's absolutely right. The what is happening right now is something that we can all learn from. And there's going to be a breakthrough. I don't know what it is. I don't know if global warming is going to cause Antarctica to melt and we find out that there's some giant city there that is 100,000 years old. I don't know what it's going to be, but something is going to happen, and we can't ignore the science today, Pat.
Correct. I got a question for you.
Yes.
At what point did science hit the gas pedal that you think?
I keep going back to 1998.
Okay, because when I was a kid, it was so different than what it is now, and it's just like something, and I just want to know what you think it was that made everything just kick off. Yeah,
if you go back, 1998 is such an important year for so many different reasons. But if you go back and you look at 1998, the breakthroughs that happened, not only in cosmology, but in physics and quantum physics and biology and the medical side. 1998 was a crazy year, and it forced other scientists to step back and go, wait a minute, we've got a lot of exploring to do. We've now corrected so many things from the past in 1998 that moving forward, it's been breakneck since 1998. And, yeah, I think 1998 was the year that forced other scientists around the world to start to rethink things. And you can also throw in Göbekli Tepe as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that goodies, man. You do not know how much I enjoy everything I've got. Göbekli Tepe. Have a good night, man.
Yeah, you too, Pat. Göbekli Tepe, and we'll see you tomorrow night. Tomorrow night is Fader night. And with that, I'm going to get out of here. And I just got a text from Rita, by the way. She said, tonight's show was so good that I don't have to wait for Taco Tuesday, that we are going to do taco trucks tonight. Yeah. Faded Black's executive producers, Rita Camurian. Shows produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee, Dennis, and Bob. Announcers are Steve Harder, Gene Vitola, Mark D. Kovar. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldridge. Intro, Spaceboy, spaceboymusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network, and syndication is KGRA, The Planet. This broadcast owned and copyrighted 2019 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. Very special thanks to Gregg Braden. Tomorrow night is Fader night. Open lines all night long. Until then, everybody be safe. Go Beckley Tepe.